Just
Fantastic. Thank you.
can I ask,
Yes.
ask a very short question? So now when it's Rosh Chodesh and Hanukkah at the same time, then now it's the long version of Hallel in the Tefillin, right? In Shacharit.
Yes. Actually, this time we can begin with that, because I wanted to, before we get into our subject for today, if you were on Shabbat at the Bet Knesset in Shul, then you will have noticed that it was very, I would say that anyone growing up in a religious home would have been confused, checking up what do we do, because we had three different things coming together on this Shabbat. We had Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh and Chanukah, and for each of those you have additions to the prayer. And you also have, like, what do you do? Because on Rosh Chodesh you have Musaf, and then on Shabbat you have Musaf. So we have a special Musaf, which is a Musaf for Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, for example, which is a special edition. But that's not enough, because then you're going to add Al Nisim to that as well. So it's like you have to keep, on track the whole time. And also something very unique that we had on this Shabbat was we read from three different Torah scrolls. Usually we have one, which is a Parashat Shavua, but then we had the Parashat Shavua, and then we had Rosh Chodesh, and then we had Chanukah. The Hallel also, Lars, as you asked, a Hallel, we have a Hallel for Rosh Chodesh, which is a shortened version, and then we have the Hallel for Chanukah, which is the full version. So we follow, what are we going to follow in each of these cases? Regarding the Hallel, we have the full Hallel throughout Chanukah. So we don't use the short version, we do the full version of Hallel. Each day of Chanukah, we have a short reading of the Torah, which is connected to the lighting of the menorah of the candelabra in the temple, which makes sense, right? Because that's what Chanukah is about. But when the word Chanukah actually means a renewal or a beginning of. So when the first time that we had the sanctuary, the Mishkan or the tabernacle, so they had special offerings for each of the tribes. So these tribal offerings, and were on each of the what was 1 day per tribe, sort of as a way to connect the tribe to the head of the tribe was giving this offering, and in that sense connecting the tribe to the sanctuary, to the tabernacle. So it's very fitting that Chanukah comes historically after the Tanakh. So we don't have any book in the Tanakh on Chanukah. We have external book called the Maccabee book, which is an interesting historical episode, but we don't consider it holy. So what are we going to read from on Chanukah? So we read from the offerings of each of the heads of the tribe, going back to when the Mikdash, or when the sanctuary was first set in the temporary sanctuary in the desert, and that is what we read on each of the days of Chanukah. So it's actually a short reading. But then on Shabbat we had Parashat Shavua. We would the story of Yosef, who has now become second in command in Egypt, and his brothers come to him, and there's an amazing moment in which he can take out all of his anger upon them, and instead he turns that to love and accepts the fact that Hashem has brought him to this place in order to care for them. And that's an amazing thing to learn. So that was the story of Shabbat. And then add to that Rosh Chodesh, which is a special offering that we gave on Rosh Chodesh. So even if Rosh Chodesh was on a Tuesday or on a Wednesday, we would still have a Torah reading. So therefore we end up with 3 readings on the Shabbat, which is quite unique. So not every shul, not every synagogue has 3 Torah scrolls that you can read from. So some of them are going back and forth between the different parts, which is time consuming. But if you have more than, sometimes you say, why do we need so many? So here's an answer. Why do you need so many Torah scrolls? Because you have a Shabbat that you have 3 different readings. So that is just a very short summary from this Shabbat. And as I said, if any of you felt confused, then it's okay, because I don't think many did not feel confused this Shabbat. Everyone was like, okay, what do we do now? What are we going to say now? The Birkat HaMazon also, I'm just going to conclude with this. The Birkat HaMazon was the longest Birkat HaMazon that we could actually have, because within the prayer after the meal, the Birkat HaMazon, so we had the extension first of Ala Nisim for Chanukah, then we had an extension for Shabbat, and then we had one for Rosh Chodesh as well. The same is true today. If you're eating a meal and you're washing, you're eating bread, then you will have two additions in the Birkat HaMazon. You will have an addition of Chanukah and also the addition for Rosh Chodesh, because today is Rosh Chodesh. We have a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, which we discussed in the past in detail. So today is the first day of the new month, and yesterday was the first day of Rosh Chodesh, the last day of the previous month. We won't go into that again, but we have 2-day Rosh Chodesh, so today is the first day of Tevet. Michael and Eva.
I just want to recommend the Sidur of Oslo. It's really easy to follow it. It's all the explanation is in Norwegian, and it's written every place where to continue, if it's Rosh Chodesh, if it's Hanukkah, if it's like that. So I recommend it.
Fantastic. Thank you. It's very good to have a siddur that you feel comfortable with, and also one that has easy explanations. Rabbi Yoav, I know, put actually years of effort into this siddur. But if you have your own siddur, which helps, I would say, for example, that certain siddurim are they're expecting a certain level of knowledge. In other words, for example, the Malmus siddur assumes that you know how to read Hebrew and assumes that you know what you're doing, and then just says, okay, in this case, this is where you're going to find it, but there's not very good explanations about what to do, because when the Malmus siddur came out in 1950, the community was quite knowledgeable in terms of, the basic traditions. But okay, since we have a very intense shiur ahead of us, I'm gonna we'll stop the discussion about Chanukah and Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat. Again, if you have any questions or you felt lost, you can always reach out to your rabbi or to me, and we're very glad to assist. What do I say is so complicated? And what we're going to discuss today is the halachot of something called the Eiruv, okay? And what we're going to talk about different aspects of something called an Eiruv. I don't know if any of you have ever been, for example, in a large Jewish community, specifically in Israel. If anyone here has seen an Eiruv, a physical Eiruv, what you might see is next to an electric pole, suddenly you see another string, and on that string you see a plastic bottle cut in half and put on a string. Has anyone ever seen this? No. Okay, sounds strange, right? So we're going to talk about, and I would also say that many people, even in Israel today, are not so aware of these halachot because they're assuming that it's taken care of for them, which it is by the Rabbanut, by the chief rabbinate of Israel, taking care to make sure this halakha is taken care of. And soon we're going to learn why it's not simple at all and what it means. In order to approach this subject, which I say is very complicated, we have to open our mind to thinking about concepts in a different way. What do I mean? The first concept that we're going to discuss today is a concept of private space. And in order to understand why, I just want us to begin by, we'll just look at one pasuk. If I can find it here, 1 second. 1 second. Of course, the page I prepared is now closed. Okay. Let's try it again. Okay. So in Exodus, in Shmot, when again it's important to note where the people are, where Am Yisrael, the Jewish people are at the time. They're traveling through the desert, and Hashem says to them one of the essential meanings of the Shabbat, and it says as follows: it says, "Ve'u ki Adonai natan lachem haShabbat, al kenu noten lachem bayom hashishi lechem yomayim." This is after the manna starts coming, is given to the people. The people, in a lack of faith of Hashem, start demanding food. And Moshe says to Hashem that, the people are demanding. And therefore Hashem says, okay, from this point on, you're going to have manna, which is undescribed food, something that came down a bit like snow in a sense, or dew on the ground, and it is unclear exactly what it was. It was a miraculous food that came down every day. And it says that Hashem has given you now every day that they would have one portion per person. And then on the sixth day, in other words, on Friday, then they would receive 2 days of food. Why? Because on the Shabbat, it is forbidden to go out and collect food. Let everyone remain in place. Shvu ish tachtav, al yetzei ish mimkomo bayom hashvi'i. Let everyone remain in place. Let no one leave the vicinity. A person shall not leave his place on the seventh day. Before we go forward, I'd like to just think about what this idea is of a place. The idea of Shabbat is that we should remain in place. But we all know that none of us follow this instruction, right? Because we all go to the synagogue, for example. So you're not staying in place. What does it mean? You're supposed to, remain in place, glue yourself down to the chair for 24 hours and not move? That's obviously not what the meaning is, even though there were some who did not follow the rabbinical interpretations, and they literally would not move the entire Shabbat. So we also know in other religions, you can have people who meditate and stay in the same place for days or for weeks. But Shabbat, on the one hand, is not supposed to be limiting. We keep talking about the idea of oneg and enjoyment of Shabbat and the food on Shabbat and the prayer and nurturing our soul. So what does it mean not to move on the Shabbat? One shall not move. So in order to understand this, we have to understand that there's an idea or a notion, a concept in the Torah of having one's place. And it's not only connected to Shabbat. And I think we all have a notion of private space and privacy, but maybe we don't know how to define it exactly. I was thinking how to approach this question, and I was thinking, where is it obvious to us that we have private space? Well, obviously in our own house or apartment, if someone were to just walk in, would say, hey, that's trespassing onto my privacy. But we have other notions of privacy as well. For example, what if I'm on a plane and the person next to me is, he says, well, this is my space. And then, slowly he's stretching out his arms and taking over half of your chair. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. Or a person falls asleep and their head starts suddenly finding its way onto your shoulder. So you feel that there's a sense, wait, I have something which is my private area, right? So we can have complex questions about this notion of privacy, because what happens if someone is outside of my private area, but they're actually doing something into my private area. For example, a simple example, someone puts on loud music. So we will have laws in every country saying you can only have music on until this hour. Why? It's not only bothersome, it's trespassing into my zone after 11 at night, so that's not okay. Not only because, what if someone, for example, creates, I have my private space, and then someone is trespassing in another way. If someone is using binoculars from their apartment and looking into mine, so that's trespassing into my private space as well. So we have different ideas of what is privacy. And I think most of us don't think of it so much. But if we were to say on Shabbat that in order to actually be able to focus on the Shabbat, there's a notion of keeping your privacy in the sense of I should know where my place is in the world. That the entire week I'm running back and forth in order to get things done. And part of the idea of Shabbat is not to do that. So if I had a full schedule on Shabbat and I'm rushing from one place to another, that in a sense is maybe also violating the Shabbat. Because it's good to have one place, as the Pasuk says, you should not leave your space on the Shabbat. You should be conscious of where you are and what space you take up on the Shabbat. Before I go forward, I just want to, does this make sense to anyone? Okay,
Yes.
so
Yes.
It's
Good.
like Chum Shabbat, no?
So we'll talk about the idea of the boundaries of the Shabbat, right? But the idea itself is important. But then you can ask yourself, well, is that something which is personal? Because privacy is very personal. But what about, are there guidelines for what this privacy entails? Because one person can be rushing back and forth and that's their space. And another person could be, be rushing inside the house. So do we have guidelines of what does it mean when it says al yetzei ish mimkomo bayom hashvi'i? But I think just to understand that concept is very important as a very basic notion. I'm going to go one step forward now, and we're going to see one more passage from Exodus as well. Okay, can someone please, if someone is willing to read for us?
I can read.
Thank you.
Moshe thereupon had this proclamation made throughout the camp: let no man or woman make further effort toward gifts for the sanctuary. So the people stopped bringing.
Okay, so you ask yourself, how is this connected in any way? And in order to understand the connection, we will have to understand the Hebrew word. What the pasuk here is talking about, the passage describes when Moshe was creating the sanctuary for the first time again. Then they asked everyone to give gifts, and people gave their private jewelry and their, private textiles that they have, and everything that was necessary in order to create the Mishkan. It was made from private donations from the people. And then there was so much that was given that there was actually too much, and Moshe had to tell the people, stop bringing. However, the word used in Hebrew is let no man or woman make further effort, but actually the word used is milacha. And we all know by now that when we see the word milacha, it rings a bell for us. 1 second. Milacha is something very specific that I know is exactly the 39 melachot that I'm not allowed to do on Shabbat. So here we understand that this effort of bringing is considered a milacha. So here, adding on to the idea of privacy and adding on to the idea of having my own private space, we understand that taking something from one space to another is considered a melacha. So before we go forward, I'd like to, does anyone have any idea of why taking from one space to another, why would that be considered a melacha?
Because you are carrying something?
You're carrying, okay, but when we think of all of the melachot that we've learned so far in Shabbat, in what way is carrying or transferring from one space to another, why is that considered? Well, the translation was effort, which we always say these translations are bad, but melacha, in what way? Because we talked about transition, we talked about you're changing fruit into a juice, so that is a melacha. You're sifting.
You go from one dimension to another dimension, and by doing that, the stuff that you're carrying, it's being created something new while you go from one dimension to another dimension.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
I think that to transport, to carry things from one place to another is something that we do every day, and we make it as a work or to create things. So they have to define what it's not the same that you do every day. So if it's not for if you only carry something inside your house or in your area, it's okay. But if it's something like you do every day for work, it's not allowed. Something like that.
Okay, thank you. Kati Amuna?
The melachot, as far as I've understood, is from what we were doing or not doing in the temple during Shabbat, the portable temple. And I'm also thinking about when we were slaves in Egypt, then we had to do these things, and now we can choose not to for Shabbat.
Thank you. So I think just picking up on a few of the ideas that you have offered here, many times when we think of what we are doing, then we think of actual action that we are doing by hand. This melacha is unique in the sense that it is not only what we are doing, but it is a process, if we use the word dimension, like Lars said, time and space are also dimensions, right? The dimensions that we have in life are not only what am I doing. I think we're in a world today which is very focused on, am I doing something? Well, one can ask, am I doing something by prayer? Yes, I'm doing something. I'm connecting to Hashem. I'm bringing down blessings to the world. I'm praying for someone. So that's an idea of something that I'm doing. I'm changing the world, but it's not in the sense of that the world would consider it doing today. It's a waste of time. So time is a dimension, space is a dimension, and then action is a dimension. Most of the melachot, or all of the melachot, I think that we spoke until now, were based on action. I'm changing something from one thing to another. Whereas this melacha is connected to dimension, which is connected to space. By transferring one thing from one place to another, I'm actually changing it. If I'm taking something, right, and I am, or even as a private person, I act differently in the house than I would act outside, right? I dress differently in the house, right? Maybe some who don't have their screens on right now are, right, dressed in a certain way. And then when you're in the public space, which is an interesting concept with the Zoom and everything now, because we're now in a public space, but we're all in our private space at the same time. It's very interesting, right? This virtual concept of virtual reality, which changes things. I'm now in Israel, and I'm with you in each of your rooms. So changing space and dimension is a very interesting concept, and we can think of it a lot about it. But Shabbat, when the Torah says, Al yetzei ish mimkomo, you shall not leave your space, it means actually you should not change a dimension. You should not change from or take with you from one dimension to another. And we're going to get to the idea of carrying on Shabbat. But even before that, I want to think of this idea of dimension. So yes, we go to a public space and we go to the synagogue or we go to the temple. So that's a spiritual element. But on the other hand, we have this idea of space, which is not that things should not change dimension, and therefore anything which is connected directly to us is with us. But if we're taking anything else, then we're carrying it from one dimension to another, and we'll get to that soon.
Can I say something?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, short. Last Shabbat, I was stuck on the train when I was coming to Malmö for Shabbat, and even if I was quite early at the same time as the travel would take, like 3 hours before, the stop was very long. So I got panicked. What shall I do when I come to Malmö, because I'm going to come too late after the light candle. And then I realized the two problems, or I realized only one problem. What should I do with the bag? So I turned off everything in the phone and everything, and closed the bag. But then afterwards, I had this very long discussion with Rav Nathan. How should I, because of this, going from this 3 or maybe 4 dimensions from the train into the station, and then from the station to the outside, and from the outside into the hotel, to the theater hotel, which is, everything is fixed there. But that was a really long discussion, a very, very big problem to do that, which
without getting into the specific details, because we will talk for an hour and a half now, but I think what you're bringing forward is that we live in different dimensions even without noticing it. And that the modern world today, people, someone in the not so long ago, it could be our grandparents or great grandparents, could be growing up in a village, living there and dying there within the same village, right? Like, but and to travel was a very big deal, and even a huge danger to travel, definitely by ship. To travel from one place to another, it's not something that you would do regularly. Today, if you're just mentioning, imagine that I'm traveling from Oslo to Malmö, for example. So I'm taking an express train, for example, getting on a flight, landing in Denmark, going across a bridge on a train, right? And then taking a public bus or a private car or a bike, however I need to get to my private apartment. So look how many dimensions of travel I've actually done. And I think that we will see soon that the Gemara actually think of the world, one of the biggest changes in terms of transportation was made during the Roman Empire, because by creating the road map of the Roman Empire, and we have the milestones until this day. You can find them throughout Europe, and you can find them in the Middle East and in Israel. You're creating roads that create huge change, because then it's much easier to travel from one place to another. And also creating cities creates a huge change as well, because the urbanization brings a lot of people together into shared space that you didn't have before. Think in Sweden, Sweden is what I'm familiar with. So think of how many small villages you have until this day out in the middle of nowhere, in which you have, you can have 10 houses together in the middle on some, out in the middle of nowhere. It's quite common. When you have a city, then in each of those houses has a very clear definition of what the space is for those houses. But then when you end up in a city, where does my private space end and where does the public space begin? Does the hallway in a building is that a shared space? Is that a public space? What am I allowed to take something out of my private apartment into even the hallway of a building? Could be a question, because that is shared space. That's no longer my private space. So these questions started popping up, I would say, as the world facilitated these changes through, especially again through the Roman Empire, I would say, more than anyone else. And our rabbis in the Talmud had to deal with these questions, which are fascinating. I'd like to go forward to another 2 psukim, and then we can understand a bit more the definition of space. So if we look at this in the prophets, we're going to see two passages from the prophets. The first one, I'll read it first in Hebrew. Im tashiv mishabat raglecha asrot chafatzecha biyom kodshi v'karat l'shabat oneg likdosh Adonai mechubad v'chibadto miasot rechecha mimtzor chefsecha v'daber davar. So the translation here is if you turn away your foot, but the word regel means your routine. One shall stop your routine because of the Shabbat from pursuing your business on my holy day, and call the Shabbat a delight and the holy of God honorable. And you shall honor it by not doing your usual ways, not pursuing your business, not speaking of it. Then you shall delight yourself in God. And I will make you ride upon the high places of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of God has spoken. In other words, in order to properly be able to focus on the Shabbat, you must have a change from your normal day. And in this sense, the prophet is coming and saying to us, it's not enough to not only do the melachot on Shabbat. It's not only enough to cut the salad properly, but rather we shall change our routines on the Shabbat in order to allow space and dimension for something called holiness. And therefore, one shall not even speak on the Shabbat about business, for example. You should be focused, or the way that you speak should even be different on Shabbat. And I think many of us, it's a challenge, but it's also a huge gift that when we turn off our phone, we're so used to routines, and that in itself is a huge change of routine. But then what do I talk about when I come to the prayer? I shall talk. Am I talking about the meaning of the reading of the Parshat Shavua of what we're reading in the Torah, or am I just talking about normal things? Because the prophet is telling us, in order to be holy, you have to allow respect and have a different dimension within the Shabbat in order to allow that. In that sense, even if we were to find a way to permit many things in the Shabbat, learning from this, we shall actually try to focus in a different way, to focus on the Shabbat and allow it its own dimension and space, which is very different from the rest of the week. And then the last pasuk that we will see from Jeremiah, he actually connects the two of these, what we've seen until now, and he says, "You shall not carry forth a burden out of your houses on the Shabbat day, nor do any work." So we see that the work of melacha is connected again to taking something out of your house. But make the Shabbat day holy as I commanded your fathers. In other words, we see that at the time of Jeremiah, it could be that people have found ways, had found ways to carry things and to take things from one place. But he's saying, no, Shabbat is supposed to be a unique day in which you allow yourself to focus. And in that sense, you shall, there's even an idea of walking slower on the Shabbat, not running. The only thing you should run on Shabbat is if you're late for prayer. If you woke up in the morning and you're late, then that would be okay. If you have a shiur and you're late for the shiur. But on Shabbat, you shouldn't be running back and forth, because the whole idea is to allow oneself to focus and to be in the moment of the Shabbat. So if we take the psukim that we saw from Shmot and from Isaiah and Jeremiah, then we're starting to get a picture of Shabbat being a dimension, having a different dimension. It's almost stepping into a different space, which is a different time space, which is a different mode of thinking, which is a different mode of speaking. Shabbat is a completely different in many, many ways. It's almost like stepping off of the planet for a second and stepping into something else. Now that we understand that, then we realize why everything, or the world that we live in, becomes very complicated for us on Shabbat. Because if I was in the desert, like our forefathers, then, okay, it's very easy to say what that means. I sit in my tent and I go to the temple, and then I walk back to my tent. I have family time, and it's all beautiful. But the world that we live in is not following the dimension that I want to be in. Yes, if I'm in Jerusalem, it might be simple as well, right? Because everything is shut down. The world almost shuts down in Jerusalem. The siren actually goes off before Shabbat every week, telling everyone it's now Shabbat, light your candles, and the city shuts down. And in that sense, it's very easy to enter that dimension of, everything is now different. But unfortunately, in Tel Aviv, even it's not like that. And never mind in the communities that we live in, it's right very far from being that space. That space I will only have in my house, and then in the community and in the synagogue. So the transferring from limiting oneself from transferring from one space to another helps me keep that space in mind. Helps me keep in mind to be focused on the basic essentials that I need in order to be in the space that I am in. And therefore, we have two basic laws, halachot, that connect us to this idea. One of them is very simple, that we're actually limited in how far we're allowed to walk on Shabbat. Again, even if we were to not be carrying anything, I don't have any bag on me, I'm not large stuck stepping into Malmo off, into Shabbat. And it happened to me once. I was in the army at the time, and I got stuck in the Galilee in the middle of on the way to a base. And I had to figure out the same in the middle of nowhere. What do I do with my bag? And I had to walk through an Arab village, which was a bit complicated at the time. So you can have very complicated situations. But let's just think about the idea of limiting my space. So even if I was to be walking, I'm not carrying anything. The Torah tells us that we're only allowed to walk 2,000 amot. An amma is about from here to here. Okay, amma means an arm's length. So the basic calculation would be that half of that is a meter, so it would be about a kilometer. So on Shabbat, if I'm in the middle of nowhere, I have to know where my space is. And therefore, I'm not allowed to walk more than a kilometer on Shabbat. However, if I'm within a city, even if the houses are not mine, that is considered a space. So I would only begin counting my space once I leave the external limits of the city. So what does that mean? As long as I have houses that are buildings that are next to one another, I can walk, I can walk as far as the city. So that can actually make a huge difference if I'm in the middle of a very small village and I want to go on a hike on Shabbat. If I'm middle of nowhere, then in order to keep my space, I'm not allowed to walk more than a kilometer outside of the city limits. So imagine I'm in a small village in the middle of, Smoland, and, okay, so I can't actually walk because then I lose my space. I have to remember, I have to be grounded. I have to know where my space is on the Shabbat. However, if there's a big city, then I can walk the entire city, even if it's 7 kilometers, or it's 10 kilometers, or it's 50 kilometers. Imagine if you're in a huge city in Paris. So that limit is never actually beginning because the entire city continues and continues. So it would make a huge difference between where I am. If I'm in Malmö, for example, then walking outside of the city limits, as long as once I have, for example, a grassy area and then a new neighborhood begins, it could be that I'm now limited, depending on the distances between the different areas. You see cities today that areas that used to be other considered other neighborhoods are now considered suburbs of a city. So it depends, but the basic rule is that I can't walk. So for example, in Tekoa, which is where I live, just at the edge of the desert, it's very relevant. I want to go on a hike in the desert in Shabbat. I'm only allowed to go a very limited distance, because otherwise I'm going to lose my space and my dimension. So that is connected to Al Yetzei Ish Mimkomo Bayom HaShvi, one should not leave his space. So that is halakha that is relevant to every one of us, especially if we're going on a vacation, right? And we're in the middle of nowhere. Beautiful, you rent a beautiful house in the middle of nowhere, or you have a summer house somewhere, then you actually very limited in how much you can even walk on Shabbat. The second, okay, so that is one subject, which is quite simple in a sense, and we can understand the meaning behind it based on what we have learned until now. The second one is what is very complicated, because what the idea that was mentioned by some of you already is that we know that we're not allowed to carry from one domain to another. What does it mean to carry? To take something with me which is not essential. For example, if I'm wearing clothing, then that's a part of me. But to take something with me that is not a part of me, and we can have many questions about this. There's differences of opinion on jewelry, for example, because is that something which is essential to me? Probably. If I have a watch, right, then if it's something which is, that I will wear, even if it stopped, it's not working at the moment, but I still wear it as jewelry, then okay. But if it's not, then it's not essential. It's not something which is a part making me feel beautiful on the Shabbat. So we have many, many questions that we can ask about this. But the idea is that besides the limitation on walking a certain different distance, I can only take myself from one domain to another. Okay, so therefore, anything else that I would be considered carrying, we saw it both in Jeremiah and we saw it in the Torah before, that would be considered melacha. Therefore, we have to have a very clear definition of what are these different domains in order to understand where am I going from one domain to another. Is everything clear until now?
Yes, it's clear.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So if we just look at the melachot on the Mishnah that you already saw a few times, then we have the Mishnah of the primary melachot, the categories of melacha, which is 40 less 1, the 39 melachot. And then, as we said, we have all of the actions that we take, and then we see that the last one of these melachot is one who carries out an object from one domain to another, from domain to domain. So it's the last melacha that we're talking about now, which is to carry from one domain to a domain. So I think I just like to read part of an introduction, just to explain to you how difficult these halachot are. We have the two largest tractates, perhaps, or one of the two longest tractates in the Talmud, or almost the longest, are Shabbat and Eruvin. And these two tractates, a huge part of them deals with discussions on these domains and the different criteria of these domains. So we're not going to manage in a short time to get through all of this. And it might take, literally, if one wanted to learn these tractates, it can take years to do so. But I'm trying to understand the essence. So let's look at the from the introduction to the Babylonian Talmud of Eruvin, which is an entire tractate which talks about this. Rabbi Steinsaltz of blessed memory, my rabbi, and of Natan, rabbi as well. He writes a beautiful introduction that you're welcome to read. It's available on Sefaria. He says as follows: In essence, the labor of carrying it out, in other words, from one domain to another, highlights the significance of Shabbat as a day of rest. Not only a day during which specific activities are prohibited, but also a day in which a premium is placed on quiet rest and a sense of relaxation. Shabbat demands that one take a break from the everyday hustle and bustle of moving and carrying from the public to the private domain and vice versa. In other words, I think anyone who has moved if you've moved to a new house, you realize that moving to a new house is much more than just packing up the boxes. You realize how much that takes up, how much energy it takes up, and planning, and where do I want things to be? What am I taking? What am I not? So this idea of moving is much more than just taking from one place to another. Similarly, the public thoroughfare calms down from its weekly business and trade. In other words, if we're living in a Jewish community, as we said, or even if I'm in Europe, this was an advantage, one can say, to the ghetto. I'm talking about the earlier ghettos in which the Jews set themselves up in specific areas, or many times were forced to do so. So the advantage of that is that you actually have an area which everything calms down, and you have a zone which is a Shabbat zone, so to say. This is accomplished by the creation of domains that are unique to Shabbat. That is, they do not correspond to the domains in force with regard to the rule of commerce, nor those of ritual purity. Transference between different domains is forbidden, as is carrying in the public domain. So if we look at Shabbat at the Talmud itself, so the Talmud itself is using Roman terms in order to try to understand, because they are living in under the Roman rule at the time, and you have public squares that you didn't have before. So when you have a main street, which was called Sratia, and a large plaza, right, which was called Platia, right? So these are, right, words that are still used today. There's the word Platia or Plaza, and Sratia. So Sratia is Main Street. And so what is a public domain? In other words, if we're trying to say what is public, because we know that the prohibition is to take from private to public. So what is a public domain? I'm reading from the Tractate of Shabbat. A main street and a large plaza, as well as alleyways, which are open on both ends to the public domain, that is a full-fledged public domain. With regard to those domains, one may not carry out from the private domain to the public domain, and one may not carry in from the public domain to the private domain. So here we have an idea of a public space. One, let's just continue a little bit more. However, a sea and a valley and a colonnade and a carmelite, we'll talk about that soon, all enter into a general category of carmelite. In other words, what if you have an open natural space, not a public space created by the public for the public, rather just an open place, a sea and a valley. So on the one hand, it's not a public domain because the public have not made it into a domain. On the other hand, it's not a private domain. So it's considered a carmelite, which means somewhere in between. It's not considered public and it's not considered private. So in other words, something which is not defined by mankind as public, but still is not private, so that would have a different criteria. But still, our sages added that even in a carmelite, we'll consider it as public, and therefore one may not carry and place in it, like a public space. So basically, the laws of Shabbat, I'm back to the introduction, to another part of the introduction by Rabbi Steinsaltz. The laws of Shabbat recognize four basic domains: a private domain, a public domain, a carmelite, which is an intermediate domain, and the fourth is an exempt domain, which is not really a domain at all. In effect, there are really only three domains in Shabbat: the private and the public, both of which are domains by public law, and the Carmelit, which is a domain by rabbinic law. All other areas fall into the category of exempt domain. In other words, in order to have a domain, I have to have someone who defines it as such, right? Because what we're talking about, a domain, it's something, or an area, it's something which I am defining, this is my private space, or I've bought this land from, from the country. So, so we have, right? So we have to have someone who defines it as such. A very complicated question is, what is considered a public domain? Because if we're following the example of the Mishkan, as we always do, we go back to the desert, then it actually becomes very complicated, because we know that the public domain that was defined by the Jewish people was at least 600,000 people, right? In their public domain. We know that that's the amount that were at Mount Sinai. So we have 600,000 people that are creating this domain. And then one could say, and there are such opinions today, that only an area in which you have such an amount of people is considered public because we're following the Torah. Other opinions would say, no, that was what was created at the time, but today, any central city will be considered a public domain, even if you don't have 600,000 people walking through. So that would make a huge difference between Deoraita and the Rabbanan. In other words, am I transgressing from the Torah or not? And also different solutions that I could have based on whether it's considered from the Torah or not. There's no question that certain areas today, for example, Times Square in New York, would be considered by all as Reshut HaRabim, as a public domain, because you have 600,000 people who are walking through there every single day. But what about our cities, which are smaller than that? Most would consider them also public domain, even according to the Torah, and therefore it would be problematic to carry, or to even find solutions to carry. So we're not going to go into the definitions of each, but I think it's very important to realize that I have what is my private domain, I have what is the public domain, and I have an in-between domain, which is called a Carmelit. It's an intermediate domain. What is a solution that can be that I can have for this for carrying on the Shabbat? The solution is actually quite simple. Not simple in practice in making the solution, but the idea based on everything that we've discussed until now is quite simple. If I were to take any domain, which might be intermediate, for example, and define it as private, then once I made that definition, then it is all come one domain, because it depends on the definition that I have made. So therefore, if I were to take an area and mark it off and say, okay, this entire area I'm defining as one, and therefore everyone in this area all agrees that we're going to consider this, our own space. Therefore, by that definition, I've made it all into private space. So what I can do quite simply in a place like, again, Israel today, since I have the chief rabbinate and they have, right, the agreement with the authorities, so they can come to the government of Israel and say, do you agree that the entire city of Jerusalem will be defined as one space? And the government of Israel said, if that's helpful to you, then we can do so. So what they will then do, and this is very, very complicated halachot, but they will actually put a physical string around the entire city, which has gateways to it, similar to as if it was a wall. Imagine like a city of an old wall, but you don't have to have the entire wall there, as long as you have what would be considered like the foundations of the wall. We're not going to go into these details, but almost every city in Israel today has such a system today. So a set up so that there will, of course, it's a huge, thing to set up, and you have to make sure before Shabbat that none of it has fallen down in the snow, for example, because you have to have this private domain which is defined. So it's very interesting if you're walking throughout Israel, then you can come to the edge of the city, and then you'll see that there's a pole there, and there will be a sign that says the Eiruv ends over here. What does the word Eiruv mean? Eiruv actually means a mixture. The word ta'arovet is a mixture. What we're doing with the Eiruv is we're mixing domains together. So we're taking what would otherwise be considered a public domain, and upon agreement by everyone, we can say this is all now a shared domain that is not considered public anymore, and therefore would not be prohibited to carry there on Shabbat. This makes a huge difference, because then you'll be able to carry a baby in a stroller. You can carry your siddur to the synagogue. You can carry with you. You can go on a hike, and you can carry a bag with you, and as long as you don't have muktzah, of course. But right, it makes a huge difference, because everyone in that space is creating a common understanding of this is a Shabbat space. And within this Shabbat space, we can all share, and we can all therefore bypass, in a sense, or find a way in which we're creating a common space, which is called an Eiruv, and within that, I'm allowed to carry, and that makes a huge difference. Yes, Lars. We can't hear you.
Yeah, if the meaning of one of the meaning of not going between different dimensions is that this is something that belongs to the working week. This is something to belong to the other life, and when we go into to Shabbat, we go in a own dimension. By doing this, by creating this big private space where we can carry things, then this haven't this any effect on the working day, some opposite effect, because then it's not going to be like then it's not going to be this stressful going between different dimensions. This is still going to be this one dimension. So it seems the different disappears.
Yeah. I think it's a nice idea that you're putting forward, but I welcome you to Jerusalem. And the minute Shabbat is out, it's back to the craziness of the week.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like
of course.
That dimension holds very well on the Shabbat. But then the second Shabbat is over, then the pizza shop guy is there the second after Shabbat is over, and he's making his pizzas, and everyone's rushing to have pizza on after Shabbat as if they haven't eaten their entire Shabbat.
But that's about activities. But this was about space. But what you're saying is that it's not only by defining and just defining spaces, but also the actions create the space. So by having this Brit together, that this is what we're going to do, the space is actually transforming by people not doing that things, and that
I agree that having a communal responsibility over something like that creates communal space as well. That when you have an idea of a shared space that everyone is working together to create, then that is something beautiful. And I'll give you another example, which is not the Rabbanut. You go to any kibbutz, right, in Israel, they have a fence surrounding. So the fact that the entire community is caring for their fence, be it that communal safety, we're caring for our safety together, but having that fence around. We were in the summer on vacation on a kibbutz, which is not religious, and we brought our own food and our own plata and everything, and we just rented out a room. and it was beautiful on a beautiful river up north. But so they had a fence surrounding the entire kibbutz, which allowed me to carry my siddur they had a very beautiful, it was actually quite emotional. You see a place which is not religious, and then these people come on their bikes and just get off their bikes and take their kippah out of their pocket, put it on, and come in, and we had a beautiful service. It was really nice to take part of that, the diversity. But again, so here you have that communal caring that really creates a space, and that space allows me for that one dimension on the Shabbat that allows me to carry on the Shabbat without any worries. One of the biggest challenges in this is the question of babies that I wanted to speak, because on the one hand, you want to go to the synagogue, and it's so important to do so. But if you're carrying, then of course your baby is essential to you, but the baby can't carry itself. Once a child is old enough to carry itself, you can help the child and carry the child. But as long as the baby is dependent on you, first of all, you can't carry the stroller because that's carrying the stroller outside. And secondly, even if you were to carry the baby on you, the baby can't hold itself up. So that would be carrying from one space to another. So that is very limiting for young parents, as long as the baby is not able to walk by its own. Because whether of course we want to go to the synagogue, but that would be problematic. Michael had a hand up, and then Tavita.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you that, for example, when we're living in Oslo, what are we allowed to carry on the way to the synagogue? Because we don't have the Tchum Shabbat or Eiruv. So what is it allowed to carry a siddur or not, or something else?
Yeah, so okay. So the very simple answer, of course, if you have specific questions of many people, you can have specific questions of, for example, carrying medicine that is necessary, or other things that you need, and then understanding that it is the Rabbanan and it is a necessity. That could be, it depends on the situation. But anything which is not a part of what I'm wearing, if I'm wearing clothes, I'm wearing a raincoat, I'm wearing a hat, I'm wearing something which is a part of my, which is something that I'm not carrying, then that would not be a problem. Anything else, which would include an umbrella, which would include a siddur, which would include anything which is, if I'll give another example, you have a blind person who's carrying a cane, then that is something essential, okay? But an umbrella is not. So I'm trying to explain the difference in that sense. If you have an older person on a wheelchair, there could be ways, in other words, that is essential to them. But if you have a cast on your foot, then okay. But if you're carrying something, then which is not an essential part of what you need, then that would be considered carrying. So you would leave your siddur at the synagogue if you have if you're going and you're being hosted by a family, and you want to bring them something for Shabbat, you should bring it before Shabbat, because you're not allowed to carry it on the Shabbat. And also you're putting them in a problematic situation because they're not allowed to assist you with the violating. So you want to do a good thing, you want to bring them something nice for the meal, but what you're doing is violating the Shabbat by bringing it to them. So that would be problematic. Yes, please.
Just one.
So I have a question that if my child is able to walk, but he cannot walk all the distance to the synagogue, would it still be allowed to assist him to manage the travel?
Once the child is able to walk by himself or herself, then it's not considered carrying if they decide that they want to go on our shoulders. Okay, it's a complicated question, but the basic answer for you is that under the circumstances that we have and the fact that we want as families to go to the synagogue, we can rely on those who allow us to carry once the child is able to walk the distance. So if the child can walk regularly, but you have 2 kilometers to walk and that is impossible, you can assist the child and you can carry him along the way.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
Yes, Tabitha, you had the question.
Yes. I don't have a dog, but I really want a dog. And I was thinking about the problem like going on a walk with him on a leash. Would that leash consider carrying? Or
It's a good question. It goes back to the question of essential. If it is considered essential or by law that you must have a leash, then it could be, and the dog is doing the carrying itself in a sense. You're not carrying, so in that sense, it could be permitted if that was the case. If it's not necessary to have a leash, then it would be something additional and therefore would be problematic. Arad.
Okay, first, this solution with the children not to come to the synagogue, it's make families that have many children in a big problem. That means that one of the parents can be many years that he's not coming to the synagogue because he cannot carry small child that have every year. That's one thing. Second, the solution that you have for carrying key. If you find solution to this, to hang it outside or on a belt, why not to do it with Siddur, for example? Why key yes and Siddur not?
Okay, so I agree that, again, as someone who I had a 6-month-old baby when we came to Sweden. So it's extremely limiting and frustrating, I would say, also because you want to be as a family at the synagogue. And what the clash here is, I would say, is that the circumstances that we're living in don't fit with what the Torah is trying to set for us on the Shabbat. I wouldn't say vice versa. I would say that we're living in a complicated situation which creates challenges, and we have to find solutions in order to try to do so. I think over time, people who find themselves committed to Shabbat and understand the importance of Shabbat will end up moving as finding a solution to live close to the Shabbat, close to the synagogue, just for this reason. Number one. Secondly, if we were to have a friend who is not Jewish, for example, they could, because it is so important, then you can ask that person for help or even pay for someone to assist you with taking the stroller, like a nanny, for example, but have a Shabbat nanny for the child, taking the child there, because for the non-Jew, it's not violating anything. And in the case, since it's necessary, then you can have such a solution. We can't permit ourselves to violate Shabbat because it's frustrating or difficult for us to do so. Regarding the key, the solution that we have with the key is to make it a part of our clothing. So what we would do is, since it's so common that we need a key, you can actually fix your belt so that the key is serving as a buckle of the belt. It sounds like a trick, but it's not, because what we're trying to learn in the shiur is the understanding of what it means. If it's a part of my clothing, then it's fine. If it's not, then it's not. I can't imagine how a siddur becomes a part of your body unless you wrap yourself up in your siddur, and that's not so respectable. So, but if you were to have a key and make it a part of your belt, and therefore it's helping you with your as part of your clothing, that would be fine. If there were solutions to have something that is essential and you can have it as a part, then that is fine. There's a discussion, what can I do, for example, if I need to have an ID card on me or a passport on me? Can I make it a part of the clothing? Can I have it in as a part? We have to have it so I'm not carrying something external. different solutions can be found for different things. A siddur is quite bulky, and I think it's actually carrying from one place to another. And most synagogues have a siddur, and you can always go to the extra effort on Friday or have two siddurim and have one that you leave in the synagogue and have one that leave at home. So I don't think the siddur is, I think that the baby is creating much more.
Okay, siddur was a poor example.
Yes.
But other things that it's smaller, and I know that you say that it's part of the belt, of the clothing belt, but I saw many that just hang it. They have some ring on the belt and they hang the key and say that this is now part of the belt. It's not something that they carry. So I say if they can do other things like that, not only key.
Yeah, I hear you. I think we shouldn't play games. I think it should either be or should not be. And I'm not saying that everyone who does, I'm not judging. I don't know what people do. I can tell you that my key is an essential part of I broke my belt basically, and then added the key and built. I bent my belt so that it's actually not usable without the key, and then the key is a part of and then I widened the leather part so that the key fits it perfectly. So I think we should try not to play games. One other thing.
And what about ID or passport? How you solve this problem that you must do it?
Yeah, I think we're not going to go into each of the, we're also past our time, but there are solutions that can be found if something is essential and we realize it's essential and you have your own rabbi to ask, or you can ask me privately. But we can go into hundreds of questions and examples right now, which we don't have the time, but you're welcome to ask privately on things according to your situation, what is considered essential and what solutions we might have. I did want to mention, though, also that it's not only in Israel. In Amsterdam, for example, it was a very big deal that they created an Eiruv just a few years ago. They used to have one hundreds of years ago when there was a big Jewish community there. And it's very complicated because it includes all these different bridges, the bridges that open and close with all the ships going through, and what is considered private and how you consider that private. And I was there, they had a huge celebration for the fact that they created an agreement with the city of Amsterdam to have an Eiruv, and you can look it up and you can find a map of the Eiruv of Amsterdam and what is included. This is something to keep in mind because if you're going on vacation, it makes a huge difference if you're going to a place with an Eiruv or a place without an Eiruv, right? So if you want to go on a vacation somewhere in Europe, there are some places that have an Eiruv, and then you can really enjoy, especially if you have a young baby. Then it's something that you can really enjoy. And I have friends, who contacted me. They said, we're going somewhere in Europe. I said, go to Amsterdam. It's a nice place. They have a beautiful synagogue, the Portuguese Sephardi synagogue there. It's beautiful. You'll enjoy yourself, and you can easily get kosher food, catering for Shabbat, and there's an Eiruv. And I was able to find them an Airbnb within the area, the zone of the Eiruv. I called up the rabbi there, and he sent me the exact roads, and we found an Airbnb. So again, it's a different mindset of this dimension. One last thing I really have to take up before we leave for today. We have a question here. What do we do about gloves, scarves, and other such garments that one wears upon walking out of one's private space, but then takes off being already outside? So regarding gloves and scarves, there is a difference of opinion. Some say that one should be careful exactly because what you're writing here, that since we take it off, we might end up taking it off and forget and carrying it outside. Suddenly it's warm outside and we're used to taking our gloves off. In the Nordic countries, since it's so essential and it could be so cold, I don't think it's an issue to carry gloves or a scarf on Shabbat, just to keep in mind not to take them off. So you can wear them to the synagogue, but make sure that make yourself an extra reminder somehow. Put a sticker. I don't know. Color the glove or something. Make yourself a reminder. Write Shabbat on the glove so that you don't forget. But because of the weather where you live, you can rely on those who permit you to wear a glove and scarf as well. Just make sure it's apart. Again, with a coat, if I'm carrying the coat, then if it's on me, it's not a problem. Suddenly it's warm outside, I take it off, tie it around me, then I'm already carrying it. So we have to remind ourselves to be careful about it. One last thing that I wanted to touch upon today, even though we're still late. There is another during the period of the first temple, and this is the last thing for today. During the period of the first temple, during King Solomon's time, it became very noticeable that people were forgetting the idea of the dimension of the Shabbat. And people were just carrying from one place to another because they had private courtyards and they were just carrying all the time between, different apartments, and that could be very relevant today. Do I have the mindset, or am I carrying a sofa over from one apartment to another on the Shabbat? So therefore, we have something which is also important, which is another type of Eiruv that we have not mentioned, which is called Eiruv Chatzeirot, a connection of the different private courtyards together. How is this done? It's done by the same idea of the physical Eiruv. If I'm living with another, this would be relevant if I'm in a Jewish community center and have different private apartments, or if I'm living even in the same apartment and I have 3 Jewish families living below and I want to take food from my apartment to them. So therefore there's a different type of Eiruv in which I'll make a common meal, which is common for all of us, and in that sense, create a common space. And this I can do I don't have to do every week. I can have a piece of matzah that doesn't go bad and another piece of something and just put it aside and there's a special bracha that I make over it, and in that sense, create a common dimension, a common space for all of the families in this building. So that would be commonly done in a community center. As I said, it would be done if I already have an Eiruv around the entire area. I don't need that. But if I don't, then it would be necessary to have what is called the Eiruv Chatzeirot. We won't go into that, but I wanted to mention it. In the same idea of using food to extend my Eiruv, if I have a friend who lives 2 kilometers outside of my town, and I want to visit them on the Shabbat, so it's a bit strange, but if I were to set a meal along the way before the Shabbat, then I can extend where the last building ends by another kilometer. Because I'm setting a meal, I'm setting my lunch. I go out on Friday and I put my lunch out, cover it somehow, and I'm going to have a picnic there. So once I'm already having a picnic there, I'm extending my space till there. And in that sense, I can gain another kilometer if it's very important. Let's say I have a friend, I have parents that I want to visit on Shabbat, then there are solutions based on, again, it's not playing games, it's based on the concept and understanding. I tried in an hour and 20 minutes to give you 2 full tractates of the Talmud and explain the idea of the dimensions. I hope we managed something today because it's very complicated, and that the basic idea you have understood. Of course, you will find if you look in, you're very welcome to read the full introduction to the Talmud of Shabbat and Eruvin by Rabbi Steinsaltz. It's available on Sefaria. And if you want to go into the details, you can read the Pninei Halacha, which is also available, that we've sent out as well. And you'll find many of the examples and questions that you are asking. But I would say that the situation in which Rabbi Melamed is writing in Israel, he's probably much more strict because you don't need all of this because you're living in Israel. But for many of you living in small communities or even in larger communities, out in the northern countries, you have many questions. And if you find something, even if it says it is not permissible, I would still ask your rabbi, because there could be, you could find ways, because it is so important. For example, in family situations, as you mentioned, Arad, or in other situations, I gave you an example of the gloves. You might find that somewhere it says you're not allowed to wear the gloves, and I explained to you why you are. So always make sure that when you're looking up specific questions, it's always best to ask your local rabbi, but you're very welcome to read the Pnei Halacha, and you'll find a lot of the details that we did not get to. Most of you have been quiet today. I hope you're not shell-shocked that this that also changes our mindset in terms of how deep the Shabbat is, that it's a completely different dimension that we actually are supposed to be in on the Shabbat. Justin, did you want to say anything?
I just wanted to say we are focused and listening carefully.
Thank you. Okay, so again, wonderful to be with you on this Hanukkah, Rosh Chodesh, and Shavuot Tov, Hanukkah Sameach to everyone. And it's just opening something maybe that you weren't so familiar with before. You're welcome to look up on the internet. I'm sure you can find pictures of the Eiruv, both in Amsterdam and in Jerusalem and other places in Israel. You'll see this funny bottles sometimes that they put just to, to make sure that the Eiruv is not falling down. So they, in our community, we have the security jeep does around every Friday, just to make sure that it hasn't fallen down, so that that space is contained. Okay, Chanukah Sameach, Shavuot Tov, Chodesh Tov to everyone, and see you. Welcome to the Wednesday shiur, and if not, next Sunday.
חג שמח.
להתראות, חג שמח, תודה רבה.
חג שמח.
טוב.
חג שמח.